Welcome. Close your eyes when you're ready and let the stillness settle over you. Close your eyes and drift with me into the quiet mystery of a kingdom's lost and forgotten crown. When this helps you sleep, subscribe. I add a new one every single night. Cetinje sits on a high karst plateau in the Western Balkans, surrounded on every side by ridges of pale gray limestone that catch the light differently at each hour of the day. Blue-white in the early morning, flat and colorless at noon, faintly amber in the last hour before the mountain dark comes down. The plateau is not large. The town that grew on it was never large. In the years when Cetinje was a royal capital, it had perhaps a few thousand permanent inhabitants. A handful of foreign legations housed in modest stone buildings along its single main road, a monastery whose bells carried clearly across the open ground, and a palace whose nearest wall stood close enough to the monastery that a person at the palace gate, on a still morning, could hear the monks at their offices without raising their eyes from whatever they were reading. This was the capital of a kingdom. The kingdom was real. Its smallness was part of what made it unusual, and its unusualness was part of what made it, in its own particular way, irreplaceable. The gray limestone ridges that ring the Cetinje plateau are not merely a backdrop. They are the reason everything that happened there happened the way it did. Montenegro, the name itself translates to Black Mountain, took its character from those ridges, from the particular difficulty of the terrain, from the way that geography concentrated a population into defensible highland positions, and gave those positions a collective stubbornness that outlasted every occupying power that attempted to hold them. The Ottoman Empire never fully pacified these mountains. The great powers of Europe watched from a careful distance. The Petrovich-Njegoš family, which governed the territory from the early 18th century onward, understood that the mountains were their first and most reliable argument for independence, and they governed accordingly, from the high ground close to the monastery, in buildings that were never grand in the European palatial sense, but were always precisely where they needed to be. The royal palace at Cetinje was a modest two-story stone building. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the European imagination of a royal palace tends towards something else entirely, toward the long facades of Versailles, or the ornate towers of the Residence, or the white marble corridors that European courts used to signal permanence and power across the centuries. The Cetinje Palace was none of these things. It was solid and well-built and maintained with care, and it sat on the edge of the plateau with its windows looking out toward the limestone ridges that had protected the dynasty for 200 years. On certain winter evenings, when the cold came down from the mountains and the monastery bells rang, and the candles in the palace windows sent their faint warmth out into the gray air, the scene had a particular quality, not grand, exactly, but self-possessed. A capital that knew what it was and did not require the validation of size or spectacle to maintain that knowledge. The dynasty that held this palace traced its ruling authority back to the early decades of the 18th century, through a succession of men who governed the mountain territories as prince-bishops, a form of authority that combined, in a single office, the spiritual governance of the Orthodox Church and the secular governance of the land and its people. This was unusual, even within the unusual landscape of pre-modern European political arrangements. Elsewhere on the continent, sacred and secular authority had long since been separated, disputed, redistributed, and in many cases stripped from the church entirely by the slow movement of Enlightenment politics. In the Montenegrin highlands, the Petrovich-Njegoš family maintained the older unity, The prince-bishop who governed was also the churchman who consecrated. The monk and the military commander inhabited the same person. The legitimacy this produced was of a different character from the hereditary legitimacy of Western European dynasties. It was simultaneously ancient and specific, rooted in the rock of the plateau and in the liturgical calendar of the Orthodox faith, and it gave the family an authority that was hard to challenge, precisely because it operated on two registers at once. This arrangement changed in the middle of the 19th century, when the then ruling prince abandoned the requirement of clerical celibacy and established the monarchy on the dynastic model more familiar to the rest of Europe, a secular throne that passed from parent to child rather than through ecclesiastical succession. The change was practical and modernizing, and it allowed Montenegro to engage with European diplomatic culture on terms that European diplomatic culture could recognize. It did not, however, entirely sever the sacred secular character of the dynasty's authority. The prince-bishops who preceded the hereditary monarchy were remembered as founders and as holy men simultaneously. The Gorski Vienich, the Mountain Wreath, the great epic poem written by Prince Bishop Petar to Petrovich Negosh in 1847, wove together the religious and the political in a voice that was understood as both literature and scripture, a foundational text in the precise sense that a people can have a foundational text. The dynasty that produced this poem, in which the poem in turn described and shaped, was not simply a ruling house. It was the Montenegrin idea of itself, given form across 2 centuries of continuous authority in the high mountain ground. The formal elevation of Montenegro from principality to kingdom came in August of 1910, when Nicola I Petrovich Negosh, who had already governed for 50 years as prince, accepted the proclamation of the kingdom at a ceremony in Cetinje, attended by European diplomatic representatives. The date matters. It was late by the standards of European monarchical history. The great kingdoms of the continent had long since stabilized their constitutional arrangements, and the era in which new kingdoms were proclaimed before assembled diplomatic witnesses was drawing quietly to a close. Montenegro's elevation to kingdom was, in this sense, among the last of its kind, a formal recognition arriving at almost the last possible moment when such recognitions were still the currency of European political legitimacy. Nicola was already in his 70s. He had ruled since 1860. He had seen the Russo-Turkish War, the Congress of Berlin, the Balkan Wars, and all the shifting alliance calculations that had defined the region's political life for half a century. The kingdom he proclaimed in 1910 was the culmination of a very long career of sovereign governance, and its international recognition was something he had worked toward for decades. It arrived, it was real, and within 8 years, it was gone. The forces that ended the kingdom of Montenegro were not sudden in the way that battles are sudden or revolutions are sudden. They moved more slowly than that, with the weight of regional political transformation behind them, the enormous reshaping of southeastern Europe that the First World War produced. Austro-Hungarian forces occupied Cetin in January of 1916, following the Battle of Mokovac, a Montenegrin defensive engagement whose circumstances are still discussed with a particular gravity in the region's military histories. King Nicola and his government departed Cetin ahead of the advancing forces into an exile that would eventually settle in France. The occupation that followed lasted until the end of the war. The Austro-Hungarian administration governed from the palace on the plateau in the modest stone building with its limestone ridge views, and the particular quality of that occupation its relationship to the palace's contents, to the collections and the objects that had accumulated there over decades of diplomatic exchange and royal ceremony, is a question that the historical record addresses only partially and not always clearly. The palace itself remained standing, the town continued to exist, the monastery bells continued to ring across the plateau, but the monarchy that had given the place its character as a capital was not present, and its absence during those occupation years created a gap in the institutional life of the city that subsequent events would fill in ways that the exiled king and his court never accepted. Nicolas I in France continued to govern in the only sense that remained available to him, the sense of insistence. He maintained his court, received visitors, wrote letters, and styled himself the legitimate sovereign of Montenegro in all his communications with European courts and governments. This was not delusional in the strict sense. The question of his legitimacy was genuinely contested, and the legal arguments his government in exile advanced were not without substance. But the practical direction of events ran against him, and the practical direction of events in the autumn of 1918 moved quickly and without much attention to legal argument. The Podgorica Assembly of November 1918 was the formal instrument through which the political question of Montenegro's future was settled, at least in the formal sense. Delegates assembled in the old Ottoman-era town, Podgorica, had a different character from Cetinje, a lowland commercial settlement rather than a highland capital, and voted to depose King Nicola and merge Montenegro unconditionally into the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Serbian troops and administrators were already present inside the country at the time of the vote. The atmosphere in the assembly hall, as surviving participant accounts describe it, was one of watchfulness, a word that appears in several testimonies and that carries within it the implication of constraint. The legitimacy of the assembly, who had been invited, who had not, under what conditions the vote had proceeded, was disputed at the time and has remained disputed in historical scholarship since. These are genuinely contested questions, the kind that historians trained in different national traditions tend to answer differently, and the record does not fully resolve them. What the record does confirm is that the vote occurred, that it produced the political result, and that the result was subsequently recognized by the Allied powers, who were at that moment reorganizing the political map of post-war Europe. Nicola's supporters called it a coup. Supporters of the unification called it a democratic expression of national self-determination. Both positions had arguments behind them. Both had arguments that the other side found insufficient. The historical conversation on these points has continued through the decades since, without arriving at the kind of settled consensus that transforms a disputed event into a received account. The assembly sits in the historical record as a contested thing, and the honest encounter with it keeps that contestation visible rather than resolving it in either direction. King Nicolo V Petrovich Nagosh died in Antibes, France in March of 1921. He was 79 years old. He had been in exile for 5 years. He had continued to regard himself as the legitimate king of Montenegro for every day of those 5 years, and his communications with European courts in the final period of his life maintained the formal address and the royal styling that his circumstances had long since made difficult to sustain in any practical way. He was buried, initially in foreign soil, in San Remo, Italy, a resting place whose distance from the karst plateau of Cetinje embodied in physical form the political displacement that had defined the last years of his life. The grave was a modest stone marker in a country that was never his, with the occasional presence of a Montenegrine tricolor laid against it by someone from the diminishing exile community who still used that particular gesture to say something that words did not quite cover. The distance between the Quechan Palace and the San Remo grave was not only geographical, it was the distance between what the dynasty had been and what it had become by the time of the king's death. The distance between the proclamation ceremony of 1910, with its assembled diplomatic witnesses and its gilded silver crown lifted in the state chamber, and the small villa on the French Riviera where an elderly king in reduced circumstances wrote letters to courts that increasingly did not reply. This compression from the high point of the kingdom's recognition to the quiet finality of the San Remo grave within a single decade gives the story of the Montenegrin monarchy its particular quality, which is not quite tragedy in the classical sense, and not quite political accident either, but something in between, something that feels like the consequence of forces that were very large and very slow, and that moved through the region without particular attention to what they were ending. The Sittinge Plateau is still there. The limestone ridges still ring it on every side. The monastery whose bells carried across the open ground to the palace gate still stands, and the bells still ring at their appointed hours in the Orthodox calendar. The palace building survived the occupation, survived the decades of Yugoslav governance that followed the occupation, survived the various political reorganizations of the 20th century that changed what country Sittinge was the old capital of, without changing the fact of the buildings themselves. A person standing at the palace gate today would still be able to hear, on a still morning, the monastery bells. The physical continuity is remarkable, given how much of the institutional and political reality that the physical setting once expressed has been altered, dissolved, or simply ended. The dynasty's 2 centuries on the karst plateau left their mark in several directions at once. They left it in the architectural character of Sittinge, which is still legible as a royal capital even in the absence of the monarchy that made it one. They left it in the literary culture of the region because the Gorski Vigenak and the other works that the prince bishops produced remained in circulation and in use as foundational texts long after the political arrangements that produced them had been swept away. They left it in the genealogical record because Nicola I had daughters who married into royal houses across Europe, Serbia, Italy, Russia, Germany, and those connections, which had once been instruments of diplomatic alliance, became after 1918 simply family history, the kind of history that shows up in the footnotes of other dynasties' biographies, rather than in the main narrative. The dynasty left its mark in the regalia it commissioned and accumulated over the decades of its formal monarchy, the objects of gold and silver and precious stone that were made to embody the kingdom's sovereignty in physical form, to be lifted in ceremonial chambers and described in diplomatic dispatches and carried across the plateau in procession on the occasions when the kingdom presented itself to the world in its full formal character. These objects, their existence, their meaning, their making, what happened to them when the kingdom ended and the palace stood occupied and the king was in France writing letters that increasingly went unanswered? These are the questions that persist, in the specific and documentary way that questions persist when the records that might answer them are incomplete or silent or simply unavailable, filed in archives that were not organized with a future inquiry in mind. There is something particular about the kind of question that cannot be answered cleanly, not because the subject is obscure or because the interest is merely speculative, but because the documents that would settle it are either missing or silent on the specific point that matters most. The Montenegrin crown jewels occupy this position in the historical record. The kingdom was real, the objects were real, their making and their meaning, and their place within the ceremonial life of the dynasty are documented well enough to give them substance and specificity. What happened to them after January of 1916, when the palace stood without its sovereign for the first time in the dynasty's history, is a different kind of record. Patchy, indirect, carrying within its silences a set of possibilities that have not been reduced to one. The king's letters from the small villa in Antibes accumulated through the years of his exile. He wrote to the kings of Italy and Britain and Spain, to presidents and prime ministers, to the heads of the Allied powers who had reshaped the map of Europe in the peace settlements of 1919. The letters argued for the restoration of his throne, for the recognition of the Podgorica Assembly's illegitimacy, for the application of the self-determination principle that the peace settlements had applied to other national communities, and not, as Nicola maintained, to Montenegro. The letters were received. They were read, or at least received and filed. The responses, when they came, were the formal and non-committal replies that chancelleries produce when they wish to acknowledge correspondence without engaging its substance. In the later years, many of the letters received no reply at all. The desk where these letters were written would have been a modest piece of furniture in a modest rented space, the kind of writing surface that a man of reduced circumstances could maintain with a degree of dignity without pretending to the equipment of a functioning court. On that desk, in the years between 1918 and 1921, Nicola composed the final arguments of a sovereignty that the world had already moved on from. The letters stacked up, the responses did not. The correspondence that had once flowed between Cetinje and the courts of Europe in the productive years of the dynasty's full authority, the diplomatic exchanges, the alliance negotiations, the royal family visits that had connected the small mountain kingdom to the larger European world, had been replaced by the one-sided transmission of a man who had not yet accepted, or perhaps simply refused to accept, the practical finality of what had happened. There is a kind of dignity in that refusal. This is not a sentiment imposed on the record from outside. It is something the record itself suggests, in the character of the letters, in their continued formal precision, in the royal styling that Nicola maintained through his illness and into the final year of his life. A man who insists on being a king in the specific formal, legal sense, even when the mechanisms of kingship have been taken from him, is making a claim about the nature of legitimacy, the argument that legitimacy does not dissolve simply because the practical power that accompanied it has been removed, that sovereignty is not merely the capacity to govern, but something prior to that capacity, something that the removal of power cannot by itself annul. Whether this argument was historically correct in Nicola's case is the question that scholars of international law and Montenegrin constitutional history continue to discuss. That he made the argument, and made it consistently and without apparent concession until the end, is what the record shows. The letters on the writing desk in Antibes, the unanswered envelopes addressed to courts in London and Rome and Madrid, the stack of correspondence that grew through the years of exile and diminished in the frequency of its responses until it became a record of a conversation conducted entirely from one side. These are the physical traces of a kingdom's end, as particular and as real as the limestone ridges of the Cetinje Plateau or the modest stone marker in the San Remo cemetery. The particularity is important. The specificity of the objects and the documents and the places is what keeps the story from dissolving into abstraction, what keeps the ending of a small and proud and genuinely unusual European monarchy from becoming merely a footnote to the larger transformations of the post-war era. The karst plateau of Cetinje received the autumn of 1921, as it had received every other autumn of the centuries before it, without particular acknowledgement that the king whose family had governed from its small palace for 200 years had died that spring in a French coastal town and would not be returning. The monastery bells rang. The limestone ridges held the morning light in their familiar way. The palace building stood in its usual place, close enough to the monastery walls that the distance between them could be crossed on foot in a few minutes. Inside the palace, whatever had survived the occupation and the subsequent administrative reorganization sat in the rooms and corridors and storage spaces that had housed it through the dynasty's active years, furniture and documents, and the ordinary accretion of objects that a ruling household produces over generations, the domestic and the ceremonial mixed together in the particular way that palaces of modest scale tend to mix them. Whether the most formal and most precious objects of the royal collection were still among those contents, or whether they had departed with the trunks in January of 1916, or whether they had found some other path through the years of occupation and political change, was a question that the palace walls did not answer. The walls simply stood, as walls do, holding the space that had once been a kingdom's heart, patient in the mountain air. In the state chamber of the Cetinje Palace, in the early afternoon of August the 28th, 1910, a gilded silver crown was lifted from a cushion of dark velvet and held briefly in the available light before the assembled representatives of the European diplomatic corps. The sapphires set into its 8 panels caught the angle of that light, and returned it changed, deeper, more interior, a blue that belonged less to the room than to some quality of the object itself. The room was briefly quiet, then the formal declaration began, and Montenegro was a kingdom, and the crown was its crown, and the objects gathered in that chamber on that afternoon became, in that moment, the material proof of a sovereignty that had taken 2 centuries of mountain governance and sacred secular authority to arrive at its formal recognition. The crown had been made in Vienna. The commission was placed sometime around 1909, when it became clear that Nicola's long negotiation with the great powers for the elevation of his principality would finally succeed. The workshop that received the commission worked in gilded silver, setting the 8 panels of the crown's body with diamonds, sapphires, and seed pearls arranged in patterns that did not arrive at their final form by accident. The octagonal structure of the crown echoed deliberately the 8-sided star of the Order of Danilo, Montenegro's highest state decoration, named for an earlier prince-bishop of the dynasty, and this echo was not decorative, but argumentative. The shape of the crown made a claim that the sovereignty being formally recognized in 1910 was not new, was not granted by the powers who now acknowledged it, but had existed in continuous and legitimate form since the mountain bishops of the early 18th century had governed both church and people from the same stone seat in the same karst plateau. A crown that looks like the highest order of the state is a crown that says the state came first. The gilded silver panels were worked with a density that rewarded close attention. Diamonds of varying sizes were set along the upper register of each panel, their cuts chosen for the way they diffused light across a wide angle rather than concentrating it at a point, practical, in the way objects intended for ceremonial use must be practical, producing a visible effect in the variable candlelight and winter daylight of a mountain palace chamber rather than requiring the sharp beam of a jeweler's lamp to show their qualities. The sapphires were placed lower, toward the middle register of each panel, deep blue stones in mill-grain settings that framed them without competing with them. Seed pearls ran along the lower edge of the crown's band, each one small and individually set, the kind of work that is nearly invisible from any ceremonial distance, but constitutes, for whoever made it, the hours and hours of a careful craft. At the apex, a small gold cross stood upright against whatever light fell on it. The eight-sided form of the crown mattered in another way as well. The Order of Danilo, whose star the crown echoed, bore on its 8 points the cross of the Orthodox faith, and the dynasty that had originated in a line of prince-bishops who governed church and secular affairs, simultaneously had never entirely separated those two sources of authority. The Petrovich-Njegoš family had governed Montenegro from the beginning of the 18th century through a succession of these bishop-princes, men who were simultaneously the heads of the Orthodox Church in the territory and the secular rulers of the mountain clans. This was an arrangement without close parallel in European governance of the period. The authority was not divided between a crown and a mitre, but held in a single person, consecrated and political at once, and the family that held it did so not by conquest or marriage, but by the peculiar legitimacy of the sacred office. When that line eventually passed from the bishop princes to the secular princes, and then to the kings, something of that original dual authority remained embedded in the dynasty's self-understanding and in the objects commissioned to represent it. The royal scepter was made in the same period, its commission almost certainly placed alongside that of the crown. It was a gilded rod of approximately 60 centimeters in length, long enough to hold with the arm naturally extended, proportioned for the scale of a human hand, and a ceremonial posture, rather than for any functional purpose. At its top, a crowned eagle spread its wings, the dynastic emblem of the Petrovich-Njegoš house, the bird that appeared on the state seal and on the personal ciphers of the royal family, rendered here in gilded metal with enough detail in its feathers and its open beak to read clearly from across a formal chamber. The shaft below the eagle was inlaid with niello work. Niello is an old technique, older than most of the states in whose ceremonies the objects incorporating it have appeared, in which a dark paste of sulfur, copper, silver, and lead is packed into incised channels cut into the metal surface, then fused by heating, then polished flat until the dark compound fills the engraved lines exactly. The effect is a drawing in black on silver or gold, permanent as carving, precise as the tool that made the channels. On the scepter shaft, the niello depicted vine and laurel motifs, the vine that runs through Orthodox iconographic tradition and through the imagery of the Balkans from ancient times, the laurel that European ceremonial tradition associated with authority and with the classical inheritance that all modern European states were in the habit of claiming. The scepter was used together with a gilded orb during the 1910 proclamation ceremony. The orb was the older symbolic form, older than any of the specific political arrangements it had appeared in, a sphere representing the world, surmounted by a cross representing the faith, carried in the left hand while the scepter rested in the right, the paired objects together forming the minimal vocabulary of European sovereign ceremony. That Montenegro, a small state on a mountain plateau above the Adriatic, with a population that could fit comfortably into a single district of Vienna, used these same ceremonial objects at its proclamation, was not imitation, but insistence, the assertion that what happened in Cetinje on that August afternoon was the same order of event as what had happened in the great European capitals at their own coronations. that sovereignty was sovereignty regardless of the scale of the territory it covered, that the gilded silver crown and the yellow worked scepter and the orb and the assembled diplomatic witnesses were not a performance of European convention, but the genuine article. Among the personal adornments of King Nicola was a ring set with a large cabochon ruby. A cabochon is a stone cut, not with facets, but smoothed and polished into a dome, a form that predates the faceted cuts that became dominant in European jewelry from the 17th century onward, and that produces a different quality of color, not the dispersed refraction of a faceted stone, but a deep concentrated warmth, a redness that looks as though it comes from inside the stone, rather than from the light playing across its surface. The ruby in Nicola's ring was said to have been a gift from Tsar Alexander II of Russia during the period of the 1876 Russo-Turkish War, when the alliance between the two states was being strengthened through the practical means of Russian funds and material supplied to the Montenegrin military. The gift of a ruby from a Tsar to a prince was an old kind of transaction, the exchange of precious objects as a form of diplomatic communication that both parties understood without requiring documentation. The stone carried meanings that a treaty could not, about affection, about alliance, about the recognition of one sovereign by another across the enormous difference in their power. The ring was one object among many that arrived at the Cetinje Palace court through this channel of Russian diplomatic generosity. The alliance between Russia and Montenegro during the last decades of the 19th century and the opening years of the 20th was one of the most sustained and materially significant relationships of the period for the smaller state. Russia supplied not only funds and weapons, but diplomatic support, the weight of a great power arguing in European councils for the interests of a mountain principality that would otherwise have had no standing in those rooms. In return, Montenegro offered Russia a foothold in the Adriatic region, a loyal Orthodox ally, and the particular symbolic value of a small people who had never been fully conquered, not by the Ottoman Empire that had surrounded them for centuries, not by the Venetians who had controlled the coast block, not by any of the forces that had swept through the Western Balkans again and again across 500 years of turbulent history. The objects that arrived at Cetinje as Russian diplomatic gifts across these decades of alliance formed what historians who have studied the collection describe as a distinct and identifiable stylistic layer within the palace treasury. They were made to Russian imperial standards, the silver meeting the assay requirements of the St. Petersburg workshops, the hallmarks present on the bases and inner surfaces of boxes, frames, and ceremonial pieces in the format used by Russian imperial goldsmiths of the period. The cloisonné enamel work that appeared on many of these objects was done in the Slavic revival patterns, fashionable in Russian decorative arts from the 1860s onward, a consciously national style that used the visual vocabulary of medieval Russian manuscript, illumination, and embroidery translated into cells of colored glass fused between thin metal walls. The result, a surface that was simultaneously jewel-like and iconographic, expensive and culturally specific. The colors ran to deep blues and greens, warm reds, gold grounds visible between the enamel cells, the whole effect rich and legible, and quite unlike the Western European decorative style of the same period. Among the workshops whose marks appeared on pieces in the Cetinje collection were those of the Fabergé house and its contemporaries in the St. Petersburg trade. The Fabergé name is now the most widely recognized of these, for reasons that have less to do with the relative quality of its output, which was high but not unique, than with the survival and subsequent auction market history of specific celebrated objects made for the Russian imperial family. The association of the Fabergé mark with surviving pieces in other royal collections is, from the historian's perspective, simply the result of the gift exchange patterns of the period. The Russian imperial family maintained relationships with a large number of European royal houses, and the gifts that moved along those relationships were commissioned from the same group of court workshops. A cloisonné enamel box bearing a Fabergé mark sitting on a shelf in the Settinger Palace treasury was not an anomaly. It was the ordinary material evidence of a normal diplomatic relationship, handled through the channels that diplomatic relationships of that kind were always handled through. The box, or the boxes, since there were several documented in pre-war descriptions of the collection, would have sat among other objects of similar form and origin, a row of diplomatic gifts accumulated over 4 decades of alliance, each one carrying on its surface the double-headed eagle of the Russian imperial gift tradition or the particular enamel patterns of the Slavic revival style. Their collective presence on the treasury shelves, a kind of three-dimensional archive of the correspondence and state visits and political negotiations that had produced them. To look at them in sequence was to read, in material form, the history of an alliance. The regalia and the diplomatic gift objects were not the only layer of meaning in the Settinger Palace collection. The crown itself carried inscriptions that did not appear on its exterior surface. Along the interior band of the crown, the surface that would rest against the head of the wearer, hidden from everyone in the room during any ceremony, ran Cyrillic lettering in fine engraved script. The inscriptions drew on 2 sources. The first was the Book of Psalms, the oldest and most continuously used text in the Orthodox liturgical tradition, its verses present in every church service, memorized by the clergy and by the devout laity, the emotional and theological foundation of Orthodox Christian worship across centuries of practice. The specific passages chosen for the crown's interior band have not been fully documented in any published scholarly account of the collection, but the tradition of inscribing crown interiors with psalm verses was ancient and consistent in Orthodox royal practice, the words placed where only the wearer could be close enough to touch them, a private covenant between the sovereign and the text, hidden inside the object that made the sovereignty visible. The second source was the Gorsky Vigenik, the Mountain Wreath, the epic poem written by Bishop Petar to Petrovich Nigosh and published in 1847. Petar, too, was himself a prince-bishop of the dynasty, one of the most significant figures in Montenegrin history, a man who governed the mountain territory through the years when the Ottoman Empire was beginning its long contraction and the question of the Balkans' political future was first opening. He was also a poet of considerable power in the South Slavic literary tradition. In the Gorsky Vigenik, an extended dramatic poem about the conflict between the Christian and Muslim communities in Montenegro in the early 18th century, became, in the decades after its publication, the foundational text of Montenegrin national literary culture, the work against which all subsequent Montenegrin writing was measured and from which the national self-understanding was partly constructed. Lines from Peter II's poem inscribed on the interior of a crown made for his great-grandnephew was a statement of dynastic and cultural continuity. "We are still the house that produced this," the crown said from the inside, where no one but the wearer could read it. There is something particular about an inscription placed where it cannot be seen during the public event the object is made for. The crown's exterior, its sapphires and diamonds and seed pearls and gilded silver panels, existed for the room, for the assembled diplomatic representatives, for the formal record of the ceremony, and the portrait photographs that followed it. The exterior was legible at a distance. It communicated sovereign status, European convention, dynastic heraldry, and orthodox faith in a visual grammar that the whole room could read simultaneously. The interior inscription communicated nothing to the room. It was addressed to the wearer, and through the wearer to the text itself, a relationship between a head and the words resting against it that was private and continuous, and entirely outside the ceremony's public register. This was not an unusual arrangement for crowned objects in the Orthodox tradition. Icons carry inscriptions on their reverses, visible only when the icon is taken from the wall. Liturgical objects carry dedications on their bases, readable only when the object is lifted and turned. The tradition of placing the most personal and theologically significant text in the location least accessible to public view is old and deliberate. It reflects a theology in which the most important communication is not the visible ceremony, but the invisible relationship between the sacred object and the person in closest proximity to it. The crown's interior inscription was, in this sense, the most orthodox thing about a crown that was otherwise deeply European in its materials and its form. The workshop in Vienna that produced the crown was, in 1909 or thereabouts, entirely innocent of all of this. The craftspeople who set the sapphires and worked the gilded silver panels and packed the niello into the vine and laurel channels of the scepter shaft were doing the technical work their training and their tools had prepared them for. The commission had arrived with specifications. The specifications were followed. The resulting objects met the requirements of the period's goldsmithing standards and the particular aesthetic requirements of a small Balkan kingdom, asserting its European credentials through the conventional symbolic vocabulary of a coronation. The workshop window looked out onto a gray European winter street, Vienna in winter, and the street was entirely indifferent to what was being made on the bench inside. That the objects would carry psalm verses on their hidden surfaces, that they would echo a bishop poet's national epic in their interior lettering, that they would be lifted in a mountain palace 2 days' journey away before an audience of European diplomatic representatives. None of this concerned the workshop beyond the technical requirements of the commission. The scepter shaft's niello work would have been done in stages. First, the design was drawn and transferred to the surface of the shaft. Then the channels were cut by hand with engraving tools, following the vine and laurel patterns through the gilded metal. Then the niello paste was prepared, the specific proportions of sulfur, copper, silver, and lead that produced the right consistency and the right color when fused, and packed into the incised channels with small tools, overfilling slightly to account for the shrinkage of the material during heating. Then the whole shaft went into heat, and the niello fused, and the paste that had been soft and friable became hard and permanent, bonded to the metal ground. Then the surface was polished flat, until the dark lines in the gilded ground were level with each other, the design now embedded in the object rather than sitting on its surface, permanent in the way that only a fused material can be. The vine motifs ran along the shaft's length in continuous curves. The laurel appeared in clusters at intervals, framing the vine, giving the eye places to rest in the movement of the pattern. The completed shaft was warm in the hand and dense with its own weight, the way well-made things are. The formal court portraits of the Montenegrin royal family from the first decade of the 20th century show what the collection looked like on a person rather than on a shelf. Queen Milena appears in several surviving photographs in a diamond peri, a matched set of pieces, tiara, earrings, necklace, and brooch, each set with diamonds in a consistent design, and in natural pearl necklaces of considerable length. The photographs were taken in studios whose conventions were the same across European royal portrait photography of the period, a painted backdrop showing a classical column or a draped curtain, good artificial lighting arranged to illuminate the subject fully, the subject's expression composed and formal in the way that royal portrait photography required, which was different from the composed formality of a private person sitting for a portrait, more public and more deliberate, the expression chosen not for its revelation of personality, but for its communication of dynastic composure. The photographs communicated what they were made to communicate. The jewels were visible. The studio was irrelevant. The person wearing the jewels was present in the image and simultaneously performing a role that was larger than any individual person. The pieces in the Montenegrin royal collection that were not made in Vienna or received as Russian diplomatic gifts were gathered through the other channels by which small royal courts accumulated their material culture, inherited pieces from earlier generations of the dynasty, gifts from visiting dignitaries and state occasions, purchases made during the royal family's travels in Western Europe, King Nicola's daughters, several of whom married into other European royal houses, one to the Italian royal family, one to the Serbian royal family, one to the Serbian royal family, one to the Serbian royal family, one to the Battenberg family, would have carried pieces of the Montenegrin collection with them as part of their dowry arrangements, and some objects from Satenja may have moved into other palaces in this way during the years before the kingdom's end. The collection was not static. It had always been moving, receiving, dispersing at its edges, while the ceremonial core, the crown, the scepter, the orb, the formal regalia of the kingdom remained in Satenja. It is the ceremonial core that gives the collection its particular quality of attention. The diplomatic gift objects were beautiful and historically significant, but they were also replaceable in kind. Another czar could have sent another cloisonné box. Another workshop could have produced another enameled frame, and the political meaning would have been equivalent. The royal crown was not replaceable in kind. It was the specific object made for the specific ceremony of the specific moment when a principality became a kingdom, and its commission and making and first use in public on that August afternoon in 1910 were unrepeatable. The sapphires in its panels had caught that particular light in that particular room before those particular witnesses. The psalm verses engraved in its interior band had rested against the head of one man on one afternoon in one mountain capital. These were not qualities that could be transferred to a replacement. The crown resting on its velvet cushion in the state chamber of the Setchenj Palace, in the years between 1910 and 1916, when it remained undisturbed in its formal position, was an object that had accomplished exactly what it was made for. The ceremony it was made for had been held. The diplomatic recognition it was meant to signal had been received. The legal elevation of the principality to kingdom had been achieved and was now recorded in the diplomatic correspondence of every European power that had sent a representative to Sechenje for the occasion. The crown sat in its place in the state chamber and was simply itself. The gilded silver and the sapphires and the seed pearls and the small gold cross at the apex, the psalm verses and the lines of the Gorsky Vienok, invisible on the interior band, the eight-sided form that echoed the order of Danilo, still making its quiet dynastic argument to anyone who looked closely enough at the shape of the thing to understand what the shape was saying. The state chamber was adjacent to the royal chapel. The chapel's sconces held candles, and the candles were lit on the occasions when the chamber was in use for formal purposes, and the candlelight moved across the crown's gilded surface as candlelight moves across any reflective surface in any room, gently, variably, responsive to the small air currents that candles themselves create. The effect was not the steady illumination of a museum case, but something warmer and less predictable, the kind of light in which an object seems to breathe. The 8 panels of the crown caught the candlelight differently, depending on the angle, the sapphires absorbing more of it, the diamonds dispersing it, the gilded silver ground reflecting it in long warm bands across the neighboring surfaces of the chamber wall and the velvet cushion below. This was the light the crown had been made for, or at least the light its makers would have anticipated when they considered how the object would appear in a palace interior, because palace interiors in 1910 still ran primarily on candles and oil lamps in their ceremonial rooms, and the goldsmithing workshops of Vienna knew this when they chose the cuts of their stones and the angles of their settings. The small gold cross at the apex of the crown was perfectly upright. This would have been a matter of careful attention in the making. A cross that sat at an angle on the object, representing a sovereignty partly founded on orthodox sacred authority, would have been, at minimum, an aesthetic failure, and in the understanding of the dynasty that commissioned it, something more than that. The cross was upright in the making, and remained upright in the display, a small vertical certainty at the top of the object, as still as the crown was still on its cushion in the chamber below the chapel, whose bells could be heard from the palace gate on clear mornings when the mountain air carried sound well across the karst plateau. The interior inscription was there in the chamber as well, of course, though it was visible to no one. The psalm verses ran along the inside edge of the band in fine engraved Cyrillic lettering, too small to read from any distance, too small to read from any distance at all. The letters were formed to be legible at the proximity of a reader holding the crown in their hands and looking directly at the interior surface, not at the distance of a state ceremony's closest observers. The mountain epic's lines ran alongside them, or interleaved with them, the same fine scale, the same Cyrillic script, the same privacy. In the chamber, with the candlelight moving across the exterior and the velvet cushion holding the crown's weight, the interior inscription was simply present, there, in the dark inside the object, whether the chamber was occupied or empty, whether the candles were lit or extinguished, whether the diplomatic witnesses had long since returned to their own capitals or were still seated in the chairs arranged for the ceremony. The words on the inside of the crown were not less present for being unreadable from outside. They were, in the understanding that had placed them there, more present, the most private and most lasting thing about the object, the part that would remain fully itself, regardless of what the exterior surface communicated to what room, at what occasion. A psalm verse inscribed on the inside of a crown does not require a ceremony to be what it is. It is what it is in the dark, in the empty chamber, in the quiet of a mountain capital, on any ordinary afternoon when no formal occasion has brought candles and diplomatic witnesses and the formal weight of European recognition into the room. The crown was still in Satinge in the years after the 1910 ceremony, still in its place, still on its cushion, still catching whatever light fell on it in the state chamber. The collection around it had continued to accumulate modestly in the way that small royal courts collections continued to accumulate in the years before the great disruptions of the early 20th century reshaped the map of European sovereignty. The Russian diplomatic gifts were still on their shelves in the treasury, the cloisonné boxes, and the enameled frames, and the silver pieces bearing the hallmarks of the St. Petersburg workshops. The scepter rested in its proper relation to the crown, the orb beside it, the formal grouping of objects that together constituted the kingdom's ceremonial identity, still intact and undisturbed. The Order of Danilo insignia, the first-class badge of the state's highest honor, a diamond and enamel star on a white and gold ribbon, were present in the collection as well. The versions held in the palace as the master examples from which lesser appointments were made. These were objects of considerable technical refinement, their enamel work meeting the standards of the best European workshops, their diamonds set in the 8-pointed star form, but the crown's own octagonal panels were designed to echo. The whole assembly of the honor consistent in its visual language with the crown and the dynastic emblem and the sacred secular history of the family that had instituted it. The Order of Danilo was named for Danilo the first of the bishop princes to consolidate the family's governance of the mountain territory, and wearing its first-class insignia was the highest acknowledgment the kingdom could offer to a visiting dignitary or a loyal servant of the state. The palace held the master examples of the insignia with the same careful attention given to the crown itself. The queen's diamond parror was part of this collection, and the pearl necklaces visible in the formal portraits, and the cabochon ruby ring said to carry the memory of a Tsar's gift and a war-era alliance, and the scepter with its vine and laurel niello work, and the gilded orb, and the cloisonné boxes, and the enameled frames, and the silver pieces in their rows on the treasury shelves. The collection was coherent. It told a story that was legible to anyone who knew how to read objects of this kind, a story about a dynasty that had governed by sacred and secular authority simultaneously, that had maintained its independence through 5 centuries of Balkan turbulence, that had finally achieved formal European recognition in 1910 after 50 years of a single ruler's patient negotiation, that had accepted the gifts of a great Orthodox ally and the commissions of Viennese craftspeople with equal ease, that had placed the most important words on its most important object, where no one watching the ceremony could ever see them. The crown that waited on its velvet cushion in the state chamber at Cetinje, in those years between the proclamation and the January that changed everything, was everything its makers had intended it to be. The gilded silver held its shape, the sapphires held their color, the seed pearls held their positions along the lower edge of each panel, each one separately set, the hours of that careful craft still present in the object's surface, long after the craftsperson who set them had moved on to other work in other winters in a Vienna street that knew nothing of mountain kingdoms or bishop princes or psalm verses inscribed in the dark interior of a crown. The inscription was there in its privacy, in the way that private things persist when there is no particular reason for them to end. The psalm verses were still themselves. The lines of the mountain epic were still themselves. The small gold cross at the apex was still perfectly upright. And in the adjacent chapel, whose sconces held their candles through the ordinary days of the palace calendar, the light that fell through the connecting door on the evenings when the state chamber was occupied found its way to the crown's gilded surface and moved across it in the way that candlelight moves, gently, variably, responsive to the small currents of a room where people are breathing and moving and conducting the slow formal business of a small kingdom at the edge of a world that was, without anyone in that room yet fully knowing it, about to become a quite different world entirely. The crown caught that light and returned. It changed. The inscription on its interior band waited in the dark inside the object, where only the head of the wearer would ever be close enough to touch it, patient with the patience of engraved metal and chosen words, resting in its own particular silence. The stone road outside the Sichenja Palace made a particular sound in the dark. Carriage wheels on wet Carrots limestone produce a low, rolling clatter that carries some distance through cold mountain air. And in the pre-dawn hours of January 1916, that sound began earlier than the household staff would have expected. Not the steady rhythm of an ordinary morning departure, but the interrupted stop and start movement of vehicles being loaded, while men worked quickly and without ceremony. The mountain darkness over the plateau was still complete. The palace windows were lit from within, the light falling in long rectangles across the cobbled approach. And in those rectangles, the figures of court staff moved back and forth, carrying trunks down the front steps and across the courtyard to the waiting vehicles below. No one paused to make a list. That is the first fact the record establishes, and it is one of the most consequential silences in the entire history of what followed. The trunks went into the vehicles unmarked as to their contents. The staff moved quickly. The sound of distant artillery had been audible the previous evening from the direction of the Tara River Valley, and the Austro-Hungarian advance, which had been anticipated for weeks, was now something measured in hours rather than days. King Nicola, 74 years old, had ruled Montenegro for more than half a century, first as prince and then as king, and everything that could be carried, everything light enough to be lifted by two men, small enough to fit in a trunk, significant enough to be worth the carrying, went with him toward the Adriatic coast as the palace lights burned behind the departing convoy, and the cold settled back over the courtyard. The road south from Sichenje descends sharply through the limestone karst toward the Adriatic shore. In January, that road carries the cold interior air of the plateau down toward the coast, and the journey, even in a motor vehicle of the period, would have taken several hours. What sat in those trunks during those hours has never been established. The record does not say. What the record does confirm is that the convoy reached the coast, that King Nicola and his immediate court subsequently departed by sea for Italy and eventually for France, and that the trunks, or some number of them, traveled with the king into an exile from which he would not return. Beyond that point, the documentation becomes thin, and then thinner still, and eventually it goes quiet in a way that has occupied historians for the better part of a century. There is something worth attending to in that quiet. When a royal household departs under military pressure, the absence of a formal inventory is entirely understandable. There was no time, there was no clerk assigned to the task. There was no reason to believe that the departure would become permanent rather than temporary. King Nicola's own letters from the earliest months of exile suggest that he expected to return, perhaps within the year, perhaps sooner. The trunks were packed with return in mind. An inventory taken in haste at the moment of departure would have seemed, to anyone packing those trunks in the pre-dawn darkness of January 1916, not merely unnecessary, but faintly defeatist, the kind of accounting a man makes when he believes the loss is permanent, not when he believes the war will turn. The war did not turn, not for Montenegro. The Austro-Hungarian forces entered Cetinje within days of King Nicola's departure. A military governor was installed. The palace was secured, its contents subject to whatever assessment the occupying administration chose to conduct. And it is here that the second great silence in the record appears. Not the silence of a departing king, with no time for paperwork, but the silence of an occupying administration that apparently looked at what remained in the palace treasury and found or recorded very little of note. The correspondence of the Austrian military governor from the occupation period survives, at least in substantial part, portions of it are held in the House, Hof- und Staatsarchiv in Vienna, the great imperial archive that absorbed the documentary legacy of the Habsburg administration, and historians who have worked through those files describe a methodical administrative record, the kind of careful bureaucratic accounting that the Habsburg military apparatus characteristically produced. The correspondence references the royal palace at Sétinger in some detail. It describes furnishings. It mentions documents. It notes the condition of various rooms and the disposition of various pieces of royal property. What it does not mention in any line that has been located in the portions of the archive that have been made available to researchers is the crown, the scepter, the orb, the jeweled insignia, the diplomatic gifts accumulated across decades of Russian-Montenegrin alliance. None of these objects appear in the official correspondence of the Austrian military governor. Historians who have examined this silence have offered two broad explanations, and the record does not decisively favor one over the other. The first is that the regalia had already left question before the Austro-Hungarian forces arrived, that it was among the contents of those unmarked trunks loaded onto vehicles in the pre-dawn darkness, and that by the time the military governor's staff walked through the palace treasury, the shelves where the crown and scepter had rested were already empty. The second explanation is that the correspondence available in the Vienna archive represents a curated selection rather than a complete record, that some portion of the documentation from the Kétenge occupation has not been released, or was destroyed, or was separated from the main administrative file and filed elsewhere under a different reference number, and that what the occupying administration actually found in the palace treasury is a question the surviving archive is not equipped to answer. Both explanations are plausible. Neither can be confirmed, and the two explanations are not mutually exclusive. It is possible that some objects left with the king while others remained, and that the fate of those that remained was documented in papers that no longer sit where researchers have looked for them. What survives from the occupation period includes a photograph of the palace treasury room taken at some point during the Austrian administration. It shows shelves along the stone walls. Some of those shelves hold objects, smaller pieces, decorative items, what appear to be documents or folios. Other brackets on those shelves are empty in a particular way. The wood surface around the empty brackets shows a faint discoloration, a slight difference in tone, where objects had rested long enough to leave a mark, and those marks are visible in the photograph to someone looking for them. The empty space above each mark is a shape. The shapes are not consistent with small decorative objects. They are consistent with larger pieces, pieces resting on purpose-made stands or cushions, pieces substantial enough to occupy their own dedicated surface. The photograph proves nothing. The marks on those shelves might represent objects removed by staff before the Austrian arrival, or objects moved to other rooms during the occupation, or objects that were never regalia at all, but merely larger decorative pieces that left a residue. But the photograph sits in the record alongside the silence of the governor's correspondence, and together they form a particular kind of gap, the kind where the absence of documentation is itself a form of information, without ever being proof of anything specific. In November 1918, the political landscape of the Western Balkans shifted. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was proclaimed. The Podgorica Assembly voted to merge Montenegro into the new state. King Nicola, still in France, still writing letters to European courts, was formally deposed by a vote he and his supporters regarded as constitutionally invalid, and conducted under conditions that made any genuine deliberation difficult. Serbian administrators, who had already moved into key positions in Kétenge and across the country, now held formal authority over the palace and its contents. It was in 1919 that the first official reference to the regalia as missing appears. The Serbian government commissioned a report on the condition of the Katenje Palace shortly after Serbian administrators consolidated their authority over the city. The report, written by officials who walked through the rooms and noted what they observed, described ransacked areas, displaced furnishings, missing items. Its description of the palace's condition suggests that in the 3 years since January 1916, the building had passed through a number of different hands and different degrees of care. Some areas showed systematic removal of contents, the careful taking of specific objects. Other areas showed less careful disturbance, the kind that accompanies opportunistic removal rather than systematic clearance. And in a passage that the Montenegrin government in exile would subsequently cite repeatedly in its correspondence with European governments, the 1919 report formally noted that the location of the royal regalia was unknown. That sentence, written in the measured official prose of a Serbian government document, noting a simple administrative fact, is the earliest formal record of the regalia as missing. It was composed in the same tone as the surrounding sentences about missing dining chairs and displaced document files. The official who wrote it treated the unknown location of the crown and scepter with the same clerical register as every other gap in the palace inventory. The sentence did not express alarm. It did not open an investigation. It simply recorded the fact that the regalia was not where it might have been expected to be, and then moved on to the next line of the inventory. The following year, in 1920, a Serbian administrative inventory of the Cetinje Palace was compiled. This one somewhat more comprehensive than the 1919 report. It listed furniture in detail. It recorded documents. It noted personal effects that remained in the royal apartments. It described carpets, curtains, porcelain pieces, framed photographs, wall hangings, and the contents of various chests and cabinets that had survived whatever had been removed. What it did not list in any entry across its full length was crown jewels, regalia, or significant quantities of precious metals or gemstones. The Montenegrin government in exile read the 1920 inventory carefully. They had read the 1919 report before it. Their interpretation of both documents was straightforward. The Serbian administration either already knew what had happened to the regalia and chose not to document it, or had found the regalia and chose not to disclose the finding. King Nicola's advisors wrote letters asserting this position. The letters went largely unanswered. By 1921, when King Nicola died in Antibes, the question of the regalia's location had already begun the slow process of becoming a settled, unresolved matter rather than an active diplomatic dispute. Not because anyone had answered the question, but because the governments capable of answering it had stopped engaging with the correspondence. The palace continued to be administered, and the question continued to sit inside the administrative record without resolution. Yugoslav historical surveys of the interwar period and its consequences were conducted periodically across the mid-20th century in the manner of official state commissions tasked with establishing an authoritative account of politically complex transitions. A survey completed in 1956 addressed, among many other subjects, the circumstances of Montenegro's absorption into the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens, and the condition of the Montenegrin royal collections at the time of transfer. The survey's researchers examined available documentation, the 1919 report, the 1920 inventory, the Austrian correspondence, the records of the Montenegrin government in exile. They spoke with surviving witnesses where they could be located. They looked at what the archive held and what it did not hold. Their conclusion, rendered in the careful language of official Yugoslav historical scholarship, was that the original location and fate of the Montenegrine crown jewels remained unresolved. 22 years passed. Another survey was commissioned in 1978. The circumstances of Montenegro's absorption into Yugoslavia were by then a subject of somewhat different political sensitivity. The specific dynamics of Yugoslav federalism in the late 1970s gave the history of the constituent republics a renewed institutional attention. The 1978 survey was conducted by different researchers, working from what was by then a somewhat larger archive, with access to some documents that had not been available to the 1956 team. They examined Austrian records. They looked at Serbian administrative documents from the transition period. They reviewed the conclusions of the earlier survey and assessed whether any new material had changed the evidentiary picture. Their conclusion was the same. The fate of the Montenegrin crown jewels remained unresolved. The two surveys, separated by 22 years, arrived at identical findings. The 1978 report was placed in an archive in Belgrade. Its gray government cover, stamped and dated, bore no indication that its contents were remarkable. It looked like any other official survey document, one volume among many, on a shelf of similar volumes from the same commission. The conclusion buried in its pages was not presented as a failure. It was presented as an accurate description of the state of the evidence. Thorough examination had been conducted, available documentation had been reviewed, and the question remained, as it had been in 1956 and as it had been in 1919, genuinely open. That openness is not a gap produced by insufficient effort. It is a gap produced by the nature of the documentation itself, by the absence of a formal inventory at the moment of departure, by the particular silence in the Austrian military governor's correspondence, by the 1919 report's single measured sentence about unknown location, by the 1920 inventory's comprehensive accounting of everything except the items most likely to have been of greatest portable value. Each of these silences is individually explicable. Taken together, they form a pattern of absence that extends from January 1916 through the entirety of the 20th century without ever resolving into a confirmed account. The regalia was gilded silver and gemstone, diamond and sapphire and seed pearl, niello-worked gold, and cloisonné enamel. These are not materials that simply dissolve. They do not decay on a shelf in a palace cellar. They do not disappear the way paper documents disappear, consumed by damp, by fire, by the slow disintegration of organic material over decades. Metal and gemstone persist. A crown made in Vienna in 1910 from gilded silver and precious stone would, if it existed somewhere undiscovered, still exist in essentially the form it had in January 1916. It would be heavier than it looked and cold to the touch, and the sapphires set into its 8 gilded panels would still catch available light and return it as the same deep blue they returned at the 1910 proclamation ceremony in Cetinje. The question of where such an object might rest, undiscovered or undisclosed, across more than a century of documented search, is one the record has not answered. Concealment is one explanation. Dispersal is another. The individual pieces separated and moved through different channels. Some sold, some retained, some passed from hand to hand in ways that removed them from any connection to their origin. Destruction is a third, though the physical properties of the materials make complete destruction a more complicated undertaking than it might appear. And there is a fourth explanation that the documentary record raises indirectly, that some of the objects were documented somewhere by someone and that the documentation exists in a file that has not yet been opened or has not yet been identified as relevant. Austrian archives are large. The Haus Hof und Staatsarchiv in Vienna holds administrative records from an empire that governed, at its height, territories stretching from Galicia to the Adriatic. The correspondence of a military governor of a small occupied Balkan capital, even a capital as symbolically notable as Katinja, represents a small portion of a very large institutional record. Researchers working on the question have examined the portions of the archive most likely to be relevant. They have not exhausted the whole. Serbian and Yugoslav archives are similarly large, and their accessibility has varied significantly depending on the political moment. Records created in the transition period between 1918 and 1921 were deposited in administrative systems that were subsequently reorganized, transferred, and in some cases consolidated in ways that make specific document retrieval a patient and uncertain undertaking. The 1919 report and the 1920 inventory were located. Whether every document created by every administrator who passed through the Cetinje Palace in that period has been located is a question the archive itself cannot easily answer. The formal conclusion of the 1978 Yugoslav survey, that the fate of the crown jewels remained unresolved, was accurate as a description of the documentary record available to that survey's researchers. It was also in a sense that no one writing the document in 1978 could have intended a summary of everything that had been said on the subject, since the first sentence in the 1919 report noted the regalia's unknown location. The finding had not changed. The archive had grown. The effort had been genuine and documented. The conclusion was the same, a gray government document, stamped and dated in 1978, a shelf in Belgrade, where it sat among similar volumes from the same commission. The conclusion inside it reaching back through 22 years to an identical conclusion, and from there back through 37 years to a single measured official sentence, and from there back to the pre-dawn darkness of January 1916, and the sound of carriage wheels on wet limestone and trunks being loaded onto vehicles without anyone pausing to make a list. The silences in the record do not speak in any single direction. They do not confirm that the regalia left with the king, or that it was found and retained, or that it was dispersed, or that it was hidden and remains somewhere undiscovered. What they confirm is only that the official accounting, assembled from multiple administrative systems, across multiple political regimes, across the better part of a century, never produced a line that said, "The crown is here, the scepter has been located, the collection has been found." That line was never written. The absence of that line is what the record shows, across its full extent, when all the layers of official documentation are set against one another and read together. There is something in the character of the documentation itself that rewards attention. The 1919 Serbian report noted the regalia as missing in the same tone it noted missing dining chairs. The 1920 inventory cataloged furniture and carpets and failed to list precious metals in the same methodical manner it cataloged everything else. The 1956 survey concluded the matter was unresolved in the same language it might have used to describe any other undetermined historical question. The 1978 survey repeated that conclusion without emphasis. Each of these documents treats the missing regalia as an administrative fact rather than a mystery, as something that belongs in the record under its correct heading, which is location unknown, and leave the space blank. An official document that leaves a space blank is a different kind of statement than a document that draws attention to the blankness. The blank space in these records is quiet. It does not insist on its own significance. It sits in the file alongside everything that was found and accounted for, marked only by what is not written, where a relevant line might have been. And it has sat that way, patient and unhurried, and consistently unremarked upon in the official tone of whatever administrative body produced the document, from 1919 through to the end of the century. The 1978 Yugoslav survey document closed on its shelf in Belgrade, its gray cover settled against the spines of the volumes on either side of it. The specific conclusion inside it, unchanged from the survey written before it, unchanged from the report written before that, unchanged from the initial official acknowledgement written in 1919, continued to be what it had always been: accurate, documented, and entirely unresolved. Some official silences, when they persist long enough across enough different administrative systems and enough different political regimes, cease to feel like gaps waiting to be filled and begin to feel instead like permanent features of the documentary landscape, not failures of the record, but honest descriptions of what the record was able to establish, and careful acknowledgments of where the record's ability to establish things simply ran out. The 1978 survey document was that kind of silence. It said, in the measured language of official Yugoslav historical scholarship, that the most thorough examination of the available evidence had produced no answer, and it placed that non-answer in the archive, and the archive received it, and the shelf closed around it, and the question went on being exactly where it had always been, open and patient, and held in a documentary silence that had by then lasted long enough to become its own kind of permanent answer. In the spring of 1955, a small team of researchers descended into the cellars beneath the Setenje Palace, carrying electric torches and a hand-drawn map of the building's subterranean spaces. The cellars were low-ceilinged and cold. The walls were cut limestone, the same gray-white stone from which the entire karst plateau around the city had been quarried and stacked over centuries, and the air carried the particular stillness of underground rooms that had been sealed for long enough that the silence had become a quality of the stone itself. Someone had chalked a mark on the flagstone floor where an anomaly in the ground had been identified in a preliminary survey, a slight irregularity in the surface, a hollow sound when the stone was struck that was subtly different from the sound the surrounding floor returned. And the team laid a measuring tape across the chalk mark and began to work. They did not find the crown. They did not find the scepter. They did not find the gilded orb, or the ruby ring, or the cloisonne enamel boxes from the Russian gift exchanges, and they did not find anything that matched the documented descriptions of the Montenegrin royal regalia. What they found, sealed behind a section of the original limestone wall that had been mortared shut sometime in the 1920s, was a cache of paper, correspondence, administrative records, personal letters written in the neat hand of a court official whose name appeared repeatedly in the opening lines, a man whose death in 1932 had apparently carried the knowledge of this hiding place with him. The documents were significant. Historians would spend years reading through them. None of them described where the jewels had gone. That first 1955 assessment established a pattern that would repeat itself across 4 decades of intermittent investigation. The palace gave up its paper, willingly enough, its hidden correspondence, and sealed administrative files, but the regalia themselves remained absent from everything the cellars and subterranean spaces produced. The chalk marks changed. The measuring tapes were laid in different configurations. The electric torches grew brighter, and the equipment more precise. The result stayed the same: Pavel Mijovich spent a substantial portion of his working life in the reading rooms of the Shettinje Museum and the archives adjacent to it, surrounded by Austrian occupation-era documents that were themselves records of absence. Mijovich served as director of the museum through the 1960s and into the 1970s, and in that capacity he conducted what remains the most systematic scholarly investigation of the lost regalia that any single researcher has produced. His method was patient and methodical in the way that serious archival work requires patience. He read the Austrian military governor's correspondence in full rather than in summary, followed the footnotes of the 1919 Serbian Administrative Survey back to their original sources, and collected oral testimonies from elderly Montenegrins who had been children or young adults during the occupation years, recording what they had heard from parents and grandparents about what had happened in the palace during those January days in 1916. The Austrian records were what drew him back most consistently. A spread of those documents, examined in the flat afternoon light that came through the museum's north-facing windows, showed the thoroughness of the occupying administration's cataloging effort, room-by-room inventories of the palace's contents, methodical German-language descriptions of furniture and furnishings and personal effects that had been left behind. A magnifying glass resting on one page made the typewritten characters larger without making the central absence any easier to explain. The crown was not mentioned. The scepter was not mentioned. Nowhere in the surviving Austrian official correspondence from the occupation period was there a reference to a gilded silver crown set with diamonds and sapphires and seed pearls, or to any object that might plausibly have been a piece of royal regalia held by a government that had just finished occupying the capital of a kingdom. Mijovich's published conclusion, which appeared in a Montenegrin cultural journal in 1974, and was later incorporated into a broader study of the palace collection's history, was measured in the way that careful scholars are measured. He did not accuse. He did not construct a chain of causation that the documents could not support. He assessed the available evidence and concluded that deliberate concealment before the January departure was a more probable explanation for the absence than either destruction or immediate dispersal, that the trunks loaded onto the vehicles in the pre-dawn cold most likely contained the most portable pieces of the collection, and that whatever remained was hidden rather than left, placed rather than abandoned, by someone who expected the separation to be temporary. The concealment theory found its most specific expression in a deathbed account recorded by a local priest in the winter of 1961 and subsequently preserved in the Cetinaj Museum's oral history collection. The priest had attended an elderly man in his final days, a man who had worked in a domestic capacity at the Cetinje Palace during the years immediately before the First World War. In the account as the priest recorded it, the dying man described a section of wall in the old kitchen wing of the palace, a section that had been modified during renovation works sometime in the early 1920s. And he described a recess bricked shut that had been closed before the renovations covered it with subsequent layers of plaster and stone. He did not say what the recess contained. He was not certain himself, having seen only the preparations and not the outcome of whatever was placed behind that wall. The priest's account was filed carefully in the museum's collection and became one of the sources Mijovich drew on in his 1974 analysis. The wall in question in the old kitchen wing was examined during a second archaeological assessment of the palace conducted in 1970. That assessment confirmed that the kitchen wing had undergone renovation works consistent with the period described. It confirmed that the current wall surface was layered, that there was older stonework beneath the plaster and the later additions. What it could not confirm with the methods available in 1970, was whether there was a sealed recess inside the older layer or whether anything had been placed there. The wall remained. The question it carried remained with it. A third formal assessment in 1995 applied ground-level acoustic testing to the kitchen wing wall and to several other sections of the palace identified in the architectural surveys as having been modified in the 1920s. The acoustic results were inconclusive. The word used in the assessment report was ambiguous, which in the specific register of that kind of technical documentation is not the same as negative. Ambiguous meant that the results fell into a range that could support more than one interpretation. The wall was not opened. The documentation remained, as it always had, at the threshold of what could be confirmed and what could not. What the three Satinja Palace assessments did produce, across the 40 years between 1955 and 1995, was a progressively more detailed map of what was not there, a cartography of absence, refined with each successive investigation, that established with considerable confidence where the regalia was not, and left the question of where it was still open. That kind of negative evidence accumulates slowly and carries a particular quality of scholarly frustration, the frustration of a field that grows steadily more precise about the boundaries of its own ignorance. Mijevich, who had started this work in the 1960s, was still writing about its unresolved state in the late 1980s, and the conclusions he reached in those later writings were not substantially different from the conclusions he had reached in 1974. The objects themselves, meanwhile, were not entirely silent. They surfaced, or things that resembled them surfaced, at intervals across the decades, in places and under circumstances that told their own fragmentary stories. In the autumn of 1998, the Montenegrin National Museum received a request for authentication from a family in Ljubljana. The family had come into possession of a decorative object some decades earlier. The documentation they provided with the request was incomplete, but the provenance they described placed the object in their family's keeping since sometime in the 1920s. The object was a jeweled badge, a diamond and white enamel star on a folded white and gold ribbon, its back surface bearing an inscription and a mark. When the museum's examination team laid it under an archival photography lamp in the condition assessment room, the inscription resolved clearly. The badge was a first-class insignia of the Order of Danilo, Montenegro's highest state honor, a decoration that had been awarded only at the personal authority of the Montenegrin sovereign, the eight-pointed star, whose design had been incorporated into the very form of the royal crown itself. The authentication file, completed in 1998, runs to 14 pages. It compares the Ljubljana badge against photographs of authenticated Order of Danilo pieces held in the museum's reference collection against the maker's marks from the Vienna workshops documented as producing the order's insignia, and against the specific dimensions and weight specifications recorded in the order's original establishment documents from the 1850s. The conclusion is stated in the file's final paragraph in the same careful institutional language that characterizes all such assessments. The badge is confirmed as an authentic first-class insignia of the Order of Danilo, produced in the period consistent with the royal collection, and is assessed as originating from the Kasatinj Palace collection with a high degree of probability. The badge now rests in the Montenegrin National Museum's permanent collection. Its decades in a Ljubljana family's private possession are documented in the authentication file, a gap of approximately 70 years between its last verified presence in the palace and its reappearance in the museum's examination room, a gap the file notes but does not attempt to explain, because the documents that might explain it do not exist. What it established for researchers who had spent years working with absences and administrative silences was something concrete and held in the hand. A piece of the missing collection had survived. It had traveled. It had been kept by someone for reasons that were now beyond recovery, and it had come back. The ceremonial knife did not come back. Its story followed a different arc, an arc that ended not with repatriation, but with an unresolved legal and institutional effort that was still continuing as of the most recent documented correspondence between the Sättinger Museum and the private Austrian collection where the knife came to rest. The knife itself is a small object, perhaps 20 centimeters in length, with a gold and turquoise handle and a blade whose ricasso bears the cipher of the Petrovich-Negosh house in engraved relief, the monogram of the dynasty that had governed Montenegro from the early 18th century, and whose authority the 1910 proclamation had formalized into a kingdom. The knife appears in pre-war photographs of the Sättinger Palace collection, catalogued among the display objects in the upper reception rooms, its handle clearly distinguishable even in the reduced resolution of the early photographic process. The cipher on the blade is legible in the photographs if the image is magnified. There is no ambiguity about identification. A Vienna Antiques Fair in 1973 produced a catalog entry that listed among the objects offered for sale a decorative Balkan object of the early 20th century with no provenance specified. The catalog entry in question, printed in small type on thin paper in the manner of trade fair publications of the period, included a small accompanying photograph. The photograph was not high quality. The caption identified the object only in the general terms already noted, and there was no detail in the catalog copy that would have alerted a casual browser to any connection with the Montenegrin royal collection. The cipher on the handle was visible in the photograph to anyone who knew what to look for. The relevant staff at the Sättinger Museum, who might have known what to look for, did not see the catalog until several months after the fair had closed. By the time the significance of the catalog entry was recognized, the knife had been purchased by a private buyer and had passed into a private Austrian collection, where it has remained since. The Sättinger Museum established the collection's identity through archival research conducted in the late 1970s, and formal correspondence regarding repatriation was initiated in the early 1980s. The correspondence has continued at intervals since then. The collection has maintained, through its legal representatives, that the provenance of the object at the time of purchase was not established, that the purchase was made in good faith at a legitimate commercial venue, and that the legal basis for a repatriation claim requires resolution of questions about ownership and jurisdiction that have not been resolved. The knife remains in the Austrian collection. The museum's documentation of its location is current. The repatriation process is described in the most recent available correspondence as ongoing. What the knife's trajectory illustrates for those who study the dispersal of displaced royal collections is the specific vulnerability of objects that travel without documentation, objects whose connection to a collection of origin becomes invisible once the label of provenance is removed or simply never applied. The 1973 catalog entry did not conceal anything. It did not describe the knife falsely. It described it with a minimum of context that happened to be insufficient for identification by anyone not already primed to look. The result was effectively the same as concealment, though the mechanism was simply the ordinary operation of an antiques trade that dealt in objects whose histories had been interrupted by war and political upheaval and the various forms of displacement that followed both. The question of whether other objects from the Sättinger Palace collection had passed through European auction and antiques markets under similarly unspecific descriptions, cataloged as Balkan decorative metalwork, as early 20th century court objects, as unattributed diplomatic gifts, was one that archival researchers had raised periodically throughout the post-war decades without any systematic method for pursuing it. The catalog of a single antiques fair is manageable. The aggregate catalog output of European auction houses and antiques markets across the entire second half of the 20th century is not manageable, not by conventional archival means. There was, however, a claim made during this period that pointed in a more specific direction, if in a direction that the documentary record could not confirm. In 1971, a former officer of the Yugoslav Security Service, the UDBA, left the country and gave a series of press interviews in Vienna and subsequently in West Germany. The officer, whose name appeared in the published interviews, described his former career in general terms and then made a specific claim about a file he had encountered in the early 1960s. According to his account, as reported in the press coverage, the file in question bore a typed reference number and a classification stamp in red ink, and its contents sheet listed several internal memoranda relating to a diplomatic matter involving Italy. The substance of the claim, as reported, was that Yugoslav authorities had privately determined by the early 1960s that the Montenegrin royal regalia, or a significant portion of it, had been removed to Italy before or shortly after the end of the Second World War, and that diplomatic approaches to the Italian government regarding the collection's location and possible return had been made and had been quietly rebuffed. The officer could not produce the file. He described its physical appearance, the pale cardboard cover, the typed reference number, the classification stamp, in the kind of specific detail that suggests genuine recollection of a real document. He could not produce it because he no longer had access to the systems in which it was held, and the Yugoslav Security Service's internal archive was not, in 1971, accessible to outside verification. The claim was reported in several European newspapers over the following weeks, were noted by researchers who were aware of the ongoing investigation into the regalia's location, and filed alongside the other unconfirmed accounts in the bodies of documentation that scholars like Majovic were assembling. No document released from Yugoslav-era archives in the years since 1991, when those archives began to become partially accessible following the dissolution of Yugoslavia, has been confirmed as the file the officer described. Researchers who have looked for memoranda relating to Italian diplomatic approaches concerning the Montenegrin royal collection have not produced a confirmed match. The claim has remained, in the published historical scholarship on the regalia, in the category of reported testimony from a single source, noted, considered, and held at the appropriate distance from the category of established fact. It cannot be confirmed, it cannot be dismissed. It sits in the archive of unresolved accounts, alongside the deathbed testimony of the palace worker and the silences in the Austrian occupation correspondence, one more thread whose other end has not been found. What the scholarship has consistently noted about the UDBA officer's claim is not whether it is true, but what it implies if it is, specifically, that a government with extensive intelligence resources and a clear institutional interest in the question had applied those resources to it and had arrived at a conclusion that pointed to Italy, and that this conclusion, if accurate, had not led to a publicly acknowledged recovery. That chain of conditional reasoning does not constitute evidence of anything beyond the claim itself, but it is the kind of reasoning that serious historical inquiry is required to acknowledge as one possibility among others, weighed against the other possibilities: concealment within Montenegro, dispersal through multiple channels, partial destruction, the simple passage of decades without documentation, and held there without being collapsed into certainty in any direction. Mijovic completed his published work on the regalia in the early 1990s and retired from the museum directorship before the dissolution of Yugoslavia formally changed the political context in which the investigation was being conducted. His conclusion, repeated in various forms across 2 decades of scholarship, remained consistent. Deliberate concealment was probable. Complete destruction was unlikely, given the documentary absence of any record of destruction. And the most plausible account of the collection's fate was one that involved dispersal, some pieces removed in the January 1916 departure, some pieces hidden within the palace or its grounds, some pieces having traveled through channels that the archival record had not yet illuminated. That formulation, dispersal rather than a single coherent fate, some pieces here and some pieces elsewhere, is less satisfying to contemplate than a single story with a single resolution. It does not resolve into a hiding place that can be excavated or a collection that can be repatriated from a single point of recovery. It implies that the regalia, if any substantial portion of it survives, may have been separated from itself decades ago and may now exist in several different places simultaneously, some authenticated and some not yet recognized, some in institutions and some in private hands, some in countries that have no particular reason to connect their holdings to a small Balkan kingdom that ceased to exist in 1918. The Order of Danilo badge in the Cetinje Museum supports this reading. The ceremonial knife in its private Austrian collection supports it further. The absence of any large-scale confirmed find, no cache, no vault, no single location where the collection has been discovered intact, is consistent with a dispersal that happened gradually across the first several decades of the 20th century, rather than all at once on a specific date. A further dimension of the investigation was introduced by a detail in the 1916 Austrian occupation records that Mijovic had noted, but that later researchers pursued more specifically. Among the Austrian cultural officials cataloging work during the occupation, a partial illustrated inventory of the palace collection in which objects were rendered in ink, with dimensions noted in the margins in German, there appeared a page whose final entry was incomplete. The hand-drawn illustration on that entry showed the partial outline of an object, a curved form, a handle of some kind, the beginning of a decorative element on the upper surface. Below the partial illustration, where a completed catalog entry would have provided dimensions and a description, there was nothing. The space was blank. The page ended there, and the cataloging continued on the following page with a different object entirely. The gap has been interpreted variously. The simplest interpretation is that the cataloging work was interrupted, that the cultural official was called away, or that the day's work ended before the entry could be completed, and that the oversight was never corrected because the occupation itself was eventually interrupted by larger events. A more speculative interpretation, noted in the scholarly literature without being advanced as established fact, is that the object in question was removed from the palace between the beginning of that catalog entry and the moment it would have been completed, and that the half-finished illustration was simply left where it stood as a record of something the official had begun to record and then could not find. Both interpretations are consistent with what the page shows. The page itself shows an object beginning and then stopping. The investigation conducted by Mijovic and those who followed him established, by the time the Yugoslav surveys of 1978 had concluded, that the formal historical record had reached its own kind of stable incompleteness. The survey's final conclusions that the fate of the Montenegrin crown jewels remained unresolved matched what Majovic's individual research had established through different means. The institutional language of the 1978 document was measured and administrative in the way that government historical surveys tend to be, but its conclusion was unambiguous in its incompleteness. The question was open. It had been open since 1919. 22 years of additional inquiry between the 1956 survey and the 1978 survey had not moved that determination. The gray cover of the 1978 survey document, stamped with its official marking and filed on an archival shelf in Belgrade, sat alongside the 1956 survey, whose conclusion it essentially repeated. Two documents, separated by 22 years of work, arriving at the same open ending. The question had not grown smaller in the interval. It had grown more precisely defined in its openness, which is a different thing, more exactly bounded, more carefully described, more thoroughly documented as a question. But it remained a question. The ceremonial knife rests in its private Austrian collection, in a room the museum's correspondence files describe by city, but not by street. The case in which it sits is not described in the correspondence, only the fact of its presence, confirmed by the collection's legal representatives in the course of the repatriation discussions, is documented. The gold and turquoise handle is there. The Petrovich-Nigosh cipher on the blade is there. The object is as clear and legible as it was in the pre-war palace photograph taken in the upper reception rooms of a small stone palace on a karst plateau in the Western Balkans, and it waits in the particular quiet of objects that have been identified and not yet returned, in the particular suspension of a repatriation process that has been ongoing for long enough that the ongoing has become its own kind of condition. What the pattern of finds, the Order of Danilo badge, the ceremonial knife, the unverified claim of a broader dispersal toward Italy, the incomplete catalog entry with its half-drawn object, suggests to those who have spent years with the documentation is not a mystery that has been concealed, but one that is simply not yet resolved. Concealment implies active maintenance, someone keeping something hidden. The evidence more closely resembles the ordinary dissolution of coherent collections under pressure, the way that objects move when the institutions that held them collapse, following paths of individual decision and circumstance that are rarely documented at the time and become progressively harder to reconstruct as the decades pass. The palace worker who knew about the bricked recess in the kitchen wing wall died in 1961 without producing the documentation of what he knew. The cultural official who began a catalog entry and did not finish it moved through the rest of his cataloging work, and presumably through the rest of his life, without explaining what had happened to the object he had begun to draw. The family in Ljubljana kept an Order of Danilo badge for 7 decades without knowing, or without disclosing, how it had come to them. Each of those silences is its own story, compact and unreachable, and together they constitute the texture of what an unresolved historical question actually looks like from the inside, not a dramatic locked door, but a series of ordinary human silences that accumulated across ordinary human lifetimes until the distance between the question and its answer became simply too wide to cross by ordinary means. The ceremonial knife sits in its case, in its room, in its city, patient in the way that objects are patient when they have been separated from their context for long enough that the separation has become their condition. The blade is cool, the cipher is clear, the turquoise in the handle has not faded, the repatriation file in the Cetinje Museum remains current, its most recent correspondence, Noting that the process is ongoing, its documentation of the knife's location current and precise. The knife is known, it is held, it is not yet returned. The stone courtyard of the Settinjay Palace was quiet in the early morning of the 2017 survey. A light mist had settled into the hollows of the karst plateau beyond the palace walls, the kind that forms overnight when cold air pools in the limestone depressions and does not lift until the sun is well above the ridgeline. In the northeast corner of the former palace garden, where the ground had been marked with a small orange flag during a survey conducted more than 6 decades before, a team of researchers was assembling equipment in the stillness before the first pass began. The survey cart carrying the ground-penetrating radar unit sat on the stone threshold of the garden entrance, its cable connections being checked and rechecked in the cold morning air. The laptop that would receive its data open on a folding table a few meters away. Everything was still. Everything was unhurried. The mist moved almost imperceptibly across the plateau beyond the walls, and the palace itself stood as it had always stood, its stone facade worn smooth by a century of mountain winters, its interior, now the province of museum administrators and conservation staff, rather than kings or their courts, and the ground beneath the garden held whatever it had always held, patient in the limestone dark, unaware that the machines above it had grown precise enough to ask it questions. The 2017 ground-penetrating radar survey was the second such assessment conducted at the Settinjay Palace grounds in 6 years. A preliminary GPR survey had been carried out in 2011 using equipment calibrated for standard subsurface mapping and had produced results that were, in the careful language of the subsequent report, suggestive of subsurface features requiring further investigation. The 2017 survey used multi-frequency GPR equipment capable of detecting metal concentrations at depths of up to 4 meters, a technical specification that represented a meaningful advance over the equipment available to any of the previous assessments of the palace grounds. The research team moved the survey cart slowly and methodically across the former garden, the radar pulses traveling downward through the stone and compacted earth with each pass, the laptop screen nearby scrolling a continuous image of what lay beneath, a color gradient representation of density and material composition, the subsurface world rendered in shifting bands of blue and orange and white. Several anomalies were identified during the 2017 survey. They were marked with small flags pressed into the soil at the corresponding surface coordinates, a row of quiet orange markers that transformed the garden into a map of its own unresolved questions. None of the anomalies were excavated during the survey itself. Each one remained what it had been before the survey began, a question the ground had not yet answered. The survey report, filed with the Montenegrin National Museum and the Institute for Art History in Vienna in the months following the fieldwork, described the anomalies in technical language that resisted easy interpretation. One entry in particular drew sustained attention from the researchers who reviewed it. In the northeast quadrant of the former palace garden, at approximately 2.5 meters depth, the multi-frequency equipment had recorded a dense metallic signature, compact, bounded, distinct from the surrounding ground material, in a way that the report's authors noted was consistent with a concentrated deposit of non-ferrous metal. The signature was small, its boundaries were well defined. It had not been there in the 1955 assessment, or rather the 1955 assessment had not been capable of finding it if it was. The equipment of that period could not have resolved an anomaly at that depth with that degree of specificity. Whether the signature represented buried metal, a geological formation, a fragment of old plumbing, or something else entirely, was a question the report declined to answer definitively. What the report did say, in a final paragraph that received careful reading, was that the anomaly warranted further investigation, and that no further investigation had yet been authorized. The flag remained in the soil above it. The soil above the flag remained undisturbed. The scholarly effort to understand what became of the Montenegrin royal regalia has proceeded in the decades since the last Yugoslav government survey, not through dramatic discovery, but through the slow, careful accumulation of documented knowledge at its edges. A collaborative project involving the Montenegrin National Museum and the Institute for Art History in Vienna began piloting artificial intelligence image recognition tools applied to digitized auction catalog archives in the years following the 2017 survey, with the specific aim of identifying objects from the Cetinje Palace collection that may have passed through the European auction market under vague or nonspecific catalog descriptions. The logic of the project is precise and practical. The European auction market of the 20th century was not short of objects catalogued only as decorative Balkan metalwork of the early 20th century, or similar formulations that described without identifying, that placed without naming. An object removed from the Cetinje Palace in the chaos of 1916, or dispersed through estate sales in the decades following the royal family's death and exile, would not necessarily have arrived at auction with its provenance intact. It would have arrived as an object. Its catalog entry would have described its materials, its approximate age, its general stylistic origin, the cipher on the handle, the inscription along the interior band, the maker's mark on the base. These details, if present, would have been visible to any researcher who held the object in their hands. In a printed catalog entry, accompanied by a small photograph, they might not have been legible at all. The image recognition software being applied to the digitized auction archives works by comparing the visible surface features of cataloged objects against a reference database constructed from pre-war photographs of the Cetinje Palace collection, from inventory sketches made during the 1916 Austrian occupation, from museum records of the pieces that were definitively identified and repatriated in the years since 1990. A researcher sits before two screens. On one screen, a digitized auction catalog page from the 1980s shows a small photograph of a gold object, cataloged only as Balkan decorative metalwork, its handle visible in the image but not named, its cipher, if there is one, too small in the reproduction to read with the naked eye. On the other screen, the software's output overlays the cataloged image with a probability grid, regions of high confidence highlighted in pale blue, the system's assessment of the likelihood that the surface features of the cataloged object match those of a documented piece from the Cetinje collection, rendered in percentages that mean something and do not mean everything. The work is slow, the archives are large. Many of the digitized catalog photographs are of poor quality, taken in the low-resolution printing standards of their decade, and the software must work with what it is given. The project has not yet produced a confirmed identification beyond those already established through traditional archival research. What it has produced is a systematic method applied to a large body of previously unsearched material, and the researchers involved in the project have described this in a recent symposium paper as meaningful progress in a field where meaningful progress has historically been rare. In 2021, a peer-reviewed article in the journal Balkanistika by historians Alexandra Shukovic and Robert Elsey offered the most current synthesis of the available documentary evidence on the fate of the Montenegrin crown jewels. The article was careful in its language and measured in its conclusions, which is to say, it was honest about what the evidence actually supported. The two historians had reviewed the Austrian occupation correspondence held in the Haushof- und Staatsarchiv in Vienna, the Serbian administrative reports of 1919 and 1920, the findings of the Yugoslav surveys of 1956 and 1978, the results of the archaeological assessments of the palace cellars conducted between 1955 and 1995, the authentication records from the 1998 identification of the Order of Danilo badge in Ljubljana, and the documentation surrounding the ceremonial knife that had passed through a Vienna antiques fair in 1973 and entered a private Austrian collection. Having reviewed this material in its totality, Shukovich and Elsie concluded with measured scholarly caution that the balance of evidence pointed neither toward complete destruction nor toward intact preservation of the collection as a whole. What the evidence suggested in their reading was a partial dispersal. The most portable pieces, rings, badges, small ceremonial objects, having moved through channels that were difficult or impossible to trace, while the larger and more distinctive ceremonial objects having moved through channels that were difficult or impossible to trace, while the larger and more distinctive ceremonial objects having moved through channels that were the crown itself among them may have remained concealed in a single location, too recognizable to sell without immediate identification, too significant to abandon entirely. This conclusion did not resolve the question of where that location might be. It did not claim to. What it offered was a framework for understanding the evidence that was consistent with everything the documentary record showed and did not contradict anything it established, which is a different kind of progress from finding the crown itself, and a more durable one. The article by Shukovich and Elsie did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared in a scholarly context shaped partly by renewed public and institutional interest in the question of the lost regalia that had developed in the years around the centenary of the kingdom's proclamation. In 2010, the National Museum in Cetinje mounted a major temporary exhibition titled Izgubljena Kruna, The Lost Crown, to mark the 100th anniversary of the 1910 proclamation ceremony, at which the gilded silver crown had first been placed before assembled European diplomatic representatives, and the formal elevation from principality to kingdom had been declared. The exhibition drew on loans from the Vienna Museum of Applied Arts, the French Bibliothèque Nationale, and several private collectors presenting objects from the Cetinje Palace collection that had been preserved in institutional holdings across Europe, alongside archival photographs, diplomatic documents, and interpretive material explaining the history and fate of the collection as a whole. An estimated 40,000 visitors came to the exhibition during its 6-month run. The number is specific and it means something. 40,000 people standing in a museum in the small mountain capital of a country whose population is well under 1 million, looking at objects that had been made for a kingdom that lasted 8 years before the forces that dismantled it arrived, and finding that the looking meant something to them. The 2010 exhibition also included, in its final gallery, a display that did not show an object so much as an absence, the replica of the Montenegrin royal crown, commissioned for the centenary year by the National Museum, faithful to the documented form of the original, in its 8 gilded silver panels, its sapphires, its apex cross, rested on a velvet cushion on a table at the center of the room. Around it, the display cases held photographs and documents. The crown itself, the replica, was the only 3-dimensional object in the room, and it was surrounded by evidence of the original's existence rather than by the original. The effect, which the exhibition's curatorial notes described as deliberate, was to make visible the shape of the absence, to allow a visitor to see what the object looked like and to understand, simultaneously, that what they were seeing was not it. The distinction mattered. The exhibition did not try to fill the gap with a substitute. It tried to make the gap visible and to hold it there, lit and legible, so that the question of what had happened to the original could be understood not as a settled historical footnote, but as an open condition that the present had inherited from the past. The practice of marking that open condition did not end with the exhibition. Since 2010, commemorative events held each March to mark the anniversary of King Nicola's death in Antibes in 1921 have incorporated a specific display in the Royal Chapel at Cetinge. The replica crown is placed on the seat of the empty throne in the chapel, resting on its velvet cushion. The candlelight from the chapel, sconces moving across its gilded surface in the particular way that candlelight moves across faceted metal, not steadily, but in small, continuous shifts. The light finding different surfaces as the flame moves. The surrounding stone walls of the chapel are hung with Orthodox icons whose gold leaf catches the same light, and the chair itself sits unoccupied, and the replica crown on its cushion marks both the presence of the object and the absence of the original. The ceremony is quiet. It has been repeated annually for well over a decade, which means that the marking of the absence has now itself become a tradition, a practice that has acquired its own duration, its own accumulated weight of repetition. The loss that the ceremony marks is more than a century old. The ceremony is much younger. Between those two timescales, something has been maintained that might otherwise have been allowed to fade. The question of what the lost regalia means, not in monetary terms, which the objects have always resisted being reduced to, but in the specific and documented ways that particular communities and institutions have continued to engage with them, is one that the scholarly record addresses carefully and with specificity. It is not a question about heritage in the abstract. It is a question about what particular people in particular institutions in a particular small country have actually done over the course of a century with the fact that the material emblems of their last royal house vanished in January 1916 and have not been definitively located since. What the record shows is that they commissioned systematic museum research in the 1960s and 1970s. They conducted archaeological assessments of the palace cellars in 1955, in the 1970s, in the 1990s. They authenticated and documented pieces that surfaced in private estates. They pursued repatriation claims for objects held in private collections abroad. They mounted a major museum exhibition at the centenary of the kingdom's proclamation. They applied new technology to old archives. They marked the absence annually in the royal chapel. None of these things is the crown. All of them are evidence of what it means to continue caring about a question whose answer has not come. The 1998 authentication of the Order of Danilo, first-class badge by the Montenegrin National Museum, remains the clearest instance of the kind of surface these objects can come from. The badge, a diamond and white enamel star on a folded white and gold ribbon, the first-class insignia of Montenegro's highest state honor, had been held by a Slovenian family since the 1920s. How it came to be in their possession was not fully documented in the authentication record. The Slovenian family had known what they had. In a general sense, it was clearly a decorated object, clearly of Central European or Balkan royal origin, but had not pursued formal identification. When the object came to the Montenegrin National Museum for examination, the authentication process involved comparison against pre-war photographs of the Kachin's palace collection, analysis of the materials and construction methods, and review of the maker's marks against records of the workshops known to have produced ceremonial orders for the Montenegrin court. The badge was confirmed as an authentic piece from the royal collection. It was photographed for the authentication file under archival lamps, its surface unmarked by the decades it had spent in private possession, its diamond-set star as legible as it had been in the pre-war palace inventory. The authentication record exists. The badge exists. The question of repatriation and what form any return might take remained as of the most recent documented reporting an open matter under discussion between the museum and the family. The ceremonial knife with the gold and turquoise handle bearing the Petrovich Njegoš cipher, which appeared at a Vienna antiques fair in 1973 and was purchased by a private buyer before its significance was recognized, occupies a different position in the record. The Kachins Museum identified the knife's location in a private Austrian collection after the purchase had already been made, establishing that the object was in known hands but in private ownership outside Montenegro. The repatriation process for the knife has not concluded. The object rests, as of the most recent information available, in a display case in a room in the private collection, a room whose location is known to the museum but not disclosed in published accounts, in a city that is named in the correspondence but not in the public record. The gold and turquoise handle is as clear and legible as it was in the pre-war palace photograph. The dynastic cipher on the blade is visible. The object is not lost, in the sense that its whereabouts are known to the parties engaged in the repatriation discussion. It is simply not yet returned, and the distance between known and returned has proven, in this case as in others, to be longer than a single document or a single conversation can cross. What the long record of searches and findings and partial recoveries shows, taken together, is something that the scholars who have worked in this field for decades have learned to hold without frustration, that the fate of the Montenegrin crown jewels was not a single event, but a long, slow dispersal, or a long, slow concealment, or some combination of the two that the documentary record has not yet resolved. The most portable pieces moved first and furthest, through channels that were opportunistic rather than planned. The more distinctive pieces, the ceremonial objects, the regalia proper, may have moved differently or not at all. The 2021 article by Shukovich and Elsie is the most careful statement the scholarly community has produced of what the evidence actually supports. And what it supports is uncertainty of a specific and structured kind, not the uncertainty of complete ignorance, but the uncertainty of a record that has been examined systematically and found to contain genuine gaps that further research has not yet closed. The ground-penetrating radar survey at the Kachins Palace grounds is one form that further research has taken. The artificial intelligence image recognition project applied to digitized auction archives is another. The annual repatriation discussions with private collectors across Austria, Slovenia, and elsewhere in Central Europe are a third. These are not the actions of people who have given up on the question. They are the actions of people who have learned to work carefully within the constraints of what is known, to add to that knowledge where they can, and to hold the uncertainty that remains with the patience that long historical questions require. The Montenegrin National Museum's current holdings related to the royal collection include documents, photographs, personal effects, diplomatic correspondence, and a handful of objects authenticated as genuine pieces from the Katanj Palace. The crown is not among them. The scepter is not among them. The gilded orb is not among them. The ruby ring, documented in the palace inventories and visible in the court photographs, is not among them. The collection that exists is a collection of what survived through institutional custody, through private family preservation, through the luck of not being in the rooms that were ransacked or the trunks that were dispersed. What did not survive through those channels either went elsewhere, into private hands, into foreign institutional collections, under vague catalog descriptions, into the ground, or was lost in ways that left no record at all. The museum holds what it holds. The question of what remains unaccounted for is answered in the Shukovich and Elsie synthesis, with the measured conclusion that the honest answer is still partial, still open, still dependent on evidence that has not yet come in. The patience this requires is a particular kind of patience. It is not the patience of waiting for something that is certainly coming. It is the patience of continuing to work on a question whose answer may never be complete, because the alternative, declaring the question closed on the basis of insufficient evidence, would be less honest than the continued uncertainty. The scholars who have worked in this field have chosen the uncertainty. They have filed their survey reports and their journal articles and their authentication records, and they have noted the anomalies that remain unexplained, and they have continued. The 2017 GPR survey flag is still in the soil above the northeast quadrant anomaly. The excavation it recommends has not been authorized. The anomaly it marks is exactly where it was when the survey was completed, as close to answering a question as a metallic signature at 2.5 meters depth can be without being excavated, which is to say not close at all, which is to say that the ground still holds its answer privately, in the dark, in the patient way that limestone has always held, whatever is placed inside it. There is something in the long shape of this story that resists the pressure to be resolved. The gilded silver crown was made in Vienna around 1910. It was placed on the head of King Nicola I at the proclamation ceremony in Cetinje in the summer of that year, before assembled European diplomatic representatives, in a moment that photographs record as formal and still and very brief, the Cyrillic inscription running along the interior band, the passage from the Psalms, placed where only the wearer's head would ever be close enough to touch it, was hidden from the room in that moment as it had always been, visible only to whoever was wearing it, legible only from inside. The kingdom lasted 8 years in its formal royal form before the Austro-Hungarian advance arrived, and the court departed, and the trunks were loaded in the pre-dawn mountain cold without a formal list of their contents. The crown went somewhere. It has been somewhere ever since. The question of where is a question that the documentary record has pursued with increasing sophistication across more than a century without producing a definitive answer, and the 2021 peer-reviewed synthesis by Shukovich and Elsie, the most careful statement yet produced of what the evidence supports, concludes that the question remains open in a specific and structured way, open to the possibility of further finds at the edge of the collection, open to the possibility of resolution through the archival methods and technological tools currently being applied, open to the anomaly in the northeast quadrant of the former palace garden, which the 2017 survey marked with a small flag and has not yet returned to excavate. The royal chapel at Cetinje is quiet in March. The commemorative ceremony in the week of King Nicola's death anniversary is a small gathering. Museum staff, local officials, members of the Petrovich-Njegoš diaspora community, when they are present, scholars working on the collection. The replica crown rests on its velvet cushion on the empty throne. The candlelight from the chapel sconces moves across the gilded surface in the continuous small shifts that candlelight makes against faceted metal, finding different surfaces as the flame moves, and the surrounding stone walls hold the orthodox icons whose gold leaf catches the same light, and the chair is empty, and the ceremony is quiet, and the absence of the original is present in the room in the specific and deliberate way that the curators intended when they designed the display, not as a wound, not as an accusation, but as an open condition that the present continues to hold carefully, year after year, in the hope that the holding itself is worth something even when the answer does not come. The partition between what is known and what is not has a specific shape in this case, more specific than most historical mysteries allow. What is known? The crown was made, it was used, it was real, it had an interior inscription too small to read from outside the wearer's head. Several objects from the collection have been identified in private holdings across Central Europe. The 1919 Serbian Administrative Report formally noted that the location of the royal regalia was unknown, and this remained the finding of every subsequent formal survey. The 2017 GPR equipment recorded a metallic anomaly at 2.5 meters in the northeast quadrant of the former palace garden, and the flag placed above it is still there, and the soil above the flag is undisturbed. What is not known, whether the anomaly represents the crown or something else, or a geological formation, or a fragment of old drainage infrastructure, or something that was buried there long after the kingdom was gone. Whether the partial dispersal that Shukovich and Elsie identified as the most probable scenario accounts for all the most significant pieces or only some of them. Whether the diplomatic approaches described by the 1971 UDBA defector in Austrian press interviews, approaches that were never confirmed by documents released from Yugoslav-era archives, actually occurred, and if they did, what they established. These questions sit in their different categories of certainty, documented and undocumented, verified and unverified, and the record holds them all without collapsing them into each other, because the record's honesty is what gives it value. The researchers at the Institute for Art History in Vienna are continuing their image recognition work through the digitized auction archives.